Welcome everybody out there. Obviously, I'm kind of new to Zoom, but um, thank you for joining us tonight and welcoming us into your homes. As Brenda mentioned, we are co-hosting this event with Nashua Community College. Every year, NCC invites us to participate in their spring lecture series, and we're extremely grateful to them for opening their doors to us. So for those of you out there that don't know about the International Dyslexia Association, we have an information tab at the end of Carol's presentation. As Brenda mentioned, NHIDA represents Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. We are a group of parents, educators that are committed to the identification and remediation of dyslexia. We have 15 members on our board of directors and are blessed to have so many talented members with such diverse skills. We do have a few board members that are retiring at the end of this year. We are looking for another board member to represent the state of Vermont. We also need someone with editing skills, usually utilizing WordPress for our website. So if anybody's out there that's interested and has a little bit of time on your hands, get in touch with us. We would love to get to know you. So now I want to give a couple shout outs. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the New Hampshire IDA Board of Directors for their openness in exploring this distance platform and approving the funds to get it done. 3 of tonight's panelists that you can see have put in countless hours getting this to where it is. I mean, it started out as an auditorium presentation, and then it went to a live stream, and then Zoom, and then it went to Carol. We're gonna film at Carol's house, and it just has been. But anyways, here we are. But Brenda Peters, our vice president, that you met during the introduction, she's also the director at the Seacoast Learning Center. Heidi Zulman will be fielding your questions tonight. Heidi is our board's conference committee chairperson. She's the curriculum coordinator for the Rochester School District, and she's also a letters trainer. At the end of the lecture, BB Casey will explain to you how to obtain CEUs. These will be limited to those of you that are filling out our exit survey tonight. BB is one of the founding members of Decoding Dyslexia in New Hampshire and was instrumental in getting our dyslexia law passed. Mike Bernard, who I think you could see, has offered a huge amount of tech support with all of these platform changes that we have. My next shout out goes to Christine Seppi. She's the president of the Pennsylvania branch of IDA, and she's the one that planted the seed that got us where we are today. Christine has been successful in live streaming lectures. We both represent large geographical areas and are striving to reach more of our membership. Guess it goes to show you how far our outreach can be. Believe it or not, we have people tonight that are Zooming in from as far as Australia. How about that? That's pretty crazy when you think about it, huh? And then my last shout out goes to Jill Kearney. I can't imagine how we would have ever been able to pull this event off without the guidance of Jill. Jill's the vice president of the Ontario branch of IDA. She was a wealth of information and extremely generous with her time. So Jill, hats off to you. But now let's talk about the star of tonight's event, Dr. Carol Tolman. You've seen her impressive bio. Dr. Tolman has dedicated her academic profession striving to increase literacy rate. Initially as a public school teacher and currently as a national and international literacy consultant. You may know Dr. Tolman's work as Louisa Motz's co-editors of Letters, Language Essentials for Teaching of Reading and Spelling. Carol has spearheaded many long-term literacy initiatives at the school, state, and district levels, both nationally and internationally. On a personal note, I met Carol about 15 years ago at an IDA conference. It was kind of funny. We were sitting in this little group. It was Judy Birch was the facilitator. It was a small session on how to get multisensory reading instruction at our college curriculum. We went around the board, around the circle, introducing ourselves, and Carol says, "I've been looking for you." this was, I don't know if she remembers that, but I do. So that was when I first met her, and this whole getting multisensory reading instruction into our college curricula was Carol's passion then, and it continues to be that. This is Carol's mission in life. She realizes that teachers don't know what they don't know, and the best way to improve students' literacy rates is to support rigor for the science of reading within higher education requirements for teachers. To that end, Carol worked in collaboration with the New Hampshire Department of Education and others on the task force to develop the resource guide in support of New Hampshire's dyslexia laws. She provided great insight. We are blessed by the many, many ways Dr. Tolman has given back to the New Hampshire community and beyond. So it's my honor to welcome Dr. Carol Tolman tonight. Thank you so much. And the show is yours, Carol.
Oh, Aileen, thank you very much. That was a very sweet introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I'll take a moment to share my screen and say that the feeling is mutual. It is so nice to be home, which I am never, very rarely home. So for me to be in New Hampshire, you're kind to say that I've helped a lot, but I always feel like I'm only here on the weekends. I've been all throughout the world, and really appreciate that many of you are either here tonight or will be listening later on to a recording of this presentation. I miss you all desperately. I do want to know that you're okay. I hope everyone's healthy and staying safe, and we will get through this. So I'm very excited about talking about phonology. Aileen, when you first asked me to present, this is a near and dear content to my heart because I really knew nothing about it. When we talk about the idea that when teachers know better, they do better, that was so me. I had no idea about the phonological layer of language and how important it was when I first got into education and teaching. So I'm excited to share my passion, tell you a little bit about my story of how I got here, but then hopefully provide some tips and tricks along the way, and enjoy our company as we go through. So a focus on phonology, the why, what, and the how. Okay. So everybody does have a story. I just want to tell you one of mine. I have many, but here's one. I'm originally from Massachusetts, but I went through the school systems there, and I went to Fitchburg State. I actually had a very good undergrad degree at that point and learned a little bit, although it was, I don't want to tell you how long ago. So we didn't know a lot about the importance of all these underpinnings of language. But nonetheless, when I fell in love, met my husband, Scott, I moved to New Hampshire, and I've been in New Hampshire. And these people that I've met in New Hampshire have been my inspiration. This is Matt. Matt was one of my students many, many years ago. One of the first students who really taught me that I didn't know what I was doing. I knew a little bit, and I tried really, really hard, but I didn't know everything that I needed to know to impact change for students like Matt. I live in the very southwestern corner of New Hampshire, almost into Brattleboro, so I'm very excited that Vermont is part of this as well. And I have great colleagues that have done a wonderful job with literacy in Vermont. But nonetheless, I was really trying to understand what it took to be able to improve literacy rates for someone like Matt. And I just read around and looked around. I got a master's degree, and that still didn't tell me everything that I needed to know. But Matt stuck with me, and he became one of my very good friends. This is Matt, of course, all grown up with his 2 children. And I follow his children because, of course, we know that dyslexia is genetic. So I watch both Skylar and Sydney to make sure that they get good educations, which they are, and that they're not hampered by an inability to be able to read or to write. They're very bright. I'll say Matt, his IQ is higher than mine, much higher than mine. This is another one of my loves. This is Bree. And Bree is Dr. Bree. She was one of my students as well. Really struggling with learning to read and learning to write. When I met her actually as a middle school student and into high school. And I also met her siblings as well and spent a lot of time working with them. Absolutely adore Bree, and she's extremely successful at this point. So I'm very excited to show you what is possible. And for all of these students, phonology was an underlying weakness for them that hadn't been caught at that point. One more picture that I'd like to share. This is a gold mine of wonderful people. One of these people, and I won't necessarily point out who, was my student. And one of them is a student now that I am managing and just kind of helping the coach with. And you really can't tell, right? Because reading disability are, you know, we don't look like we have a reading disability necessarily, or dyslexia. But I'm very, very proud of how all my students have done. The hundreds and hundreds of wonderful people that I've gotten to meet as I've taught have taught me equally as much, if not more, than I've taught them. So I'm going to share some of that information and knowledge as I work through. And as I found out that many of these people, my students, had phonological issues even when they were older, I actually, well, I'll show you. I got so excited about that I really worked on phonology. You know, I really believe in stalking people, and I mean that in a really nice way. I adored Pat Lindemood, and I got training in as many programs as I could at the time when I was teaching, and LIPS was one of them, the phonemic sequencing program. And I considered myself the LIPS queen. I absolutely loved the ability to be able to work with phonology. So much so that when I worked in classes, I worked with progressing. I did this little booklet or pamphlet here for a course that I would teach, Progressing in Phonology, and it's still near and dear to my heart this day. I actually thought at one point I was overdoing it. I might have thought, well, wait a minute, just because I like it, maybe it's not as important as I really think it is. But in fact, the phonological processing system within our brain is crucial. And it's important for us to have not only an accurate, but now Dr. Kilpatrick will tell us, an automatic or a proficient phonological processor, to be aware of those phonemes, because once we do, we then can put our words in the visual word form area as if by sight. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let me show you why I mean that. Tonight I'll talk about the why of assessing and teaching phonological awareness by starting out where I had my big aha. When I talked about and tried to understand a little bit more about language, some of my journeys took me to American International College at the time, AIC. And in meeting Louisa Moats around the time that I was working in Keene, and having her help me understand that there was some more information that I needed to know, my eyes were opened up to phonology and what was happening in a good reader's brain, and why not all readers were easily taught, if you will. So this picture here, which of course I think of Stanislaw Dehaene when I think of this image here. Many of you might have seen his videos on Facebook or YouTube, but when we think about our brains, we are a speech-to-print system. And when we think of the phonemes and talking about phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, where that happens to be housed in our brain is toward this frontal lobe. I just advanced to show you the number 44, because I keep in mind that the English language has 44 phonemes. We don't have 26 phonemes, right? As the 26 back here is representing the idea that we have 26 letters in our alphabet. However, we utilize 44, we have to have 44 phonemes represented by those 26 letters. No wonder this is not an easy task. So in our brains, if we think about the phonological processor, our ability to process those phonemes is imperative to be able to then put words back in our occipital lobe. Sometimes when I'm explaining it to people, I do this. If you can see my hand here, but I have my left hemisphere. And right here, as you see in this picture here, I often take a look and say that the information when I read comes into the front of my brain, and it's processed back here in my occipital lobe. You see that right here on the slide. This is the visual area that we teach. It's not a natural area in our brain to look at letter and letter patterns. We have taught that specifically, hopefully, within schools. In order to get words as if by sight, back here in that visual word form area near that occipital lobe, that has to follow through, the information has to go through what we call that phonological loop. The ability to be able to go from the speech sounds to hooking on the letter and the letter patterns that represent those speech sounds is imperative. And once we are aware of a phoneme, a speech sound, we then can park that letter and letter representation and recognize that and represent it instantaneously, as if by sight. That's actually the true definition of a sight word, not a word that is irregular or a word that is high frequency, but a word that we know instantly because it has gone through that phonological loop and we've made a memory trace and orthographically mapped that back here in our visual word form area. I knew none of that when I was teaching, but as I learned about, you learn from Pat Lindemood, learned from Lorna Murphy, Dr. Lorna Murphy, who was a premier professor. She was the head of my chair. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Dr. John Willis, who is near and dear to my heart. I just love you. And he graciously accepted to be on my committee as well. And I know many of you in New Hampshire have been touched by his graciousness and his intellect. Just ask him not to climb any more ladders if you see him. Nonetheless, when we talk about our words and how we put those in our visual word form area, the phonological processor is paramount. So that's our focus for tonight. When we think about this and why the phonological processor is so important, information from Fletcher, Fuchs, Lyons, and Barnes helps inform us as to why that phonemic awareness is a weak link for some of our students and our lowest students who have difficulties in reading. You might have seen this graph, but I wanted to revisit this for just a heartbeat to talk about the difference between a student that does not have difficulty with reading. You see that in the green line. And when you look at all the different variables that have been tested, those variables are not that weak across the board. When you look at the red line, which is math disabilities, you'll notice that there are some difficulties with some of those sub-skills, the variables here, especially you see it going a little bit lower with the rapid naming piece. However, look at that drastic difference with phonological awareness for the dotted blue line or the reading disabled line. So we often find that students that have weaknesses, not all, and that's been a little bit of a discussion, of course, nationally, but many students who have trouble with reading also have trouble with phonological awareness. It's kind of that parking lot to getting words into that visual word form area. That's actually one of the biggest ahas for me that started helping me unlock the key for people like Bree or Matt or my other students where they had weak phonology, and no matter how hard and fast and strong I was trying to teach phonics, it wasn't sticking for them. So with that in mind, this is not my student, but at one point I came across this second grader, and a speech and language pathologist kindly offered a little video of her experiences. And in making this a little personal, I wanted to share with you this video so you could see what this is like. Now, please know that this is a bit ago, so it's the first version of the CTOP, the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing. However, it's not truly given in a very standardized form. So for those of you who are assessors, please don't worry. I just wanted us to listen to this content and see if you can identify what this young girl in second grade was struggling with. And she came to the speech and language pathologist's attention because she was a very precocious kindergarten child, was doing a great job. First grade, doing pretty well. Teacher's pet, just loved her. She's very gregarious. Once you get to see her, you'll see why. And in second grade, that all came to a screeching halt. So much so that people at school thought something perhaps was happening at home, where there was a problem that they really wanted to look in a little bit more in more depth. But nonetheless, this held the key to what might have been happening for her, and her frustrations were really rearing. So let's take a look and see if you can hear what this sounds like and what she struggles with.
Okay. Say toothbrush. Toothbrush. Now say toothbrush without saying tooth. Brush. That's right. Let's try the next one. Say airplane. Airplane. Now say airplane without saying plane. Air. Good. Say donut. Donut. Now say donut without saying dough. Oh, no. Oh, no. Okay, listen. Say donut without saying dough. No. You got it. Say popcorn. Popcorn. Now say popcorn without saying corn. Pop. Good. Say baseball. Baseball. Now say baseball without saying base. Ball. You're so smart. Say spider. Spider. Now say spider without saying dirt. Dirt. Spider. Spider. Good. All right. Now we're going to play some games where we take away smaller parts of the words. Say cup. Cup. Now say cup without saying cut. Cut. Without saying pup. Pup. Okay. Cup without saying cup. Okay. Okay, listen for just a second. Say okay. Cup. Cup. Now say cup without the k. Up. Okay, up. Now, say meat. Meat. Now say meat without saying meat. Mm-hmm. Meat. Just me. 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 Say farm. Farm. Now say farm without saying arm. Good. Say bold. What? Bold. Bold. Now say bold without saying b. Do. Okay. Say mat. Mat. Say mat without saying m. T. Okay. Say tan. Tan. Oh wait, let me do this. Say bold. Bold. Now say bold without saying b. Old. 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 Say mat without m. Mat. 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 No. Mat without m is at. 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 Okay. Say tan. Tan. Now say tan without saying t. Am. Okay. Say mic. Mic. Say mic without saying k. Ike. Good. Say time. Time. Now say time without saying m. I'm. Good. Say tiger. Tiger. Now say tiger without saying g. Okay. Say powder. Powder. Now say powder without saying d. Pound. 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 Just a second. All right. Good job, sweetie. All right. Let's go on to the next one. You ready? Yeah. You can stop this for a sec. Let's stop. Hi. Goodbye, Natalia.
She is ready to be done with that. All right. So when we think of the second grader and hear her, you can tell that while the story is that she is getting frustrated at school, in school and not really being as cooperative as she used to be in kindergarten and first grade, you can tell that there's an underlying weakness here. You might have remembered it and seeing it, of course, at the syllable level and hearing when she was struggling, trying to figure out things like simply donut, right, without dough. Or when you said cup was the first sound with the cup and taking the k off of up. She really did struggle a bit. But I just want us to think about her as a second grader because we definitely know, and we could have known way back in kindergarten what to do about that because of her phonemic weakness. Here's another instance. This is a spelling inventory that I created for letters. It's an elementary spelling inventory. And you might notice here that these, well, there's 30 words, these 25 attempts right in here that the student is writing in his own handwriting aren't all correct. And we may have trouble reading some of these. Mud, nap, set, fog, rib, life, shack, pretty good. stone. Number 9 is trunk. That nasal sound. We'll talk about that phonemically. Goat. It's a phonemic representation. Number 11. What do you think that is? That word is not escape, it's scrape. Beat. And number 13. What do you think that word might be? It's not chap, it's champ. Third. Number 15. I'm going to let you think about those for the rest. We'll come back to this one here, but one question I have is, what grade level do you think the student truly is? So Brenda's going to help us out with a poll here to see if you can join in, and please take a moment to vote for us. Do you think this student with this writing sample, this spelling inventory sample, would be a first grader, a third grader, a fifth grader, or a seventh grader? So please take a moment to make your choice and submit your poll results. As you're doing that, and hopefully we'll get a fair amount of people being able to submit that, you might notice that in number 16, that word is, yeah, I think I heard you say that, bridges. 17, it's not crunch, it's crutch. And so that's actually good phonology, right? 18 would be growing. 19 is walked. Born, spoil, smiling, slipping, shouting. And what do you think number 25 is? Higher. So Brenda, do we have results from our poll? What do we think people are thinking about how old the student is? First, third, fifth, or seventh? So I can see the results here. Thank you, Brenda. So 44%, or almost half of us, think this is a fifth grader. 36%, or about a third of us, think it is a third grader. 8% think it's a first grader, and 12% think this is a seventh grader. So I'd like to keep that in mind. We'll revisit that poll result toward the end of our presentation to identify exactly how old that student was and what we're going to do about that. Okay. Brenda, thank you very much for those poll results. So we talked about the why that is so important, the foundation to getting words into our visual word form area. What is it that we need to be knowing about this? And I'm so pleased to be speaking and supporting New Hampshire's branch of the IDA. I've been an IDA member for a long, long time. I actually used to take my students from New Hampshire with me, and we co-presented a number of times a few years back at the conferences. And we've evolved now to have what we call the knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading, which is a wonderful move in our field to be able to articulate what it is that teachers need to know and be able to do to be impactful, to teach reading and to teach writing. I so wish that I had that when I was going through my original education. Of course, this is now adopted by the IDA, and it's at the Center for Effective Reading Instruction, or CERI, and you can all take a K-PERI, it's PERI exam, K-P-E-E-R-I, which you see on the screen, stands for the Knowledge and Practice Examination for Effective Reading Instruction. So when you take that exam, and you can go to their sites, there's the CERI site and sign up for that. When you take that exam, you will see that all the information and knowledge that you need to know as a well-educated professional is represented extremely accurately in that exam. So it's a really nice move to move toward really good licensure, if you will, and testing. But I have to tell you, which is something that's very interesting, I've had lots of experiences in my little pocket of the world here when I'm home on the weekends, where I'm out and about. And one story in particular really stands out for me. And it's the time where it was around Christmas, and I was in a local mall, a small little mall, the Colony Mill. And the woman that was behind one of the registers was very, very flustered. And there was a long line. Of course, it was right before Christmas, which is the 24th is usually when I do my shopping. I don't know about you. So she was very flustered, and I thought, oh, this poor girl, it's so busy. She must be overwhelmed. So when I got up to her, I said, are you okay? Can I help you? Is there something I can do? And she looked up and she said, no, and just burst out crying and took this big book from underneath a shelf and shoved it at me. And she said, look at this. I have been going to school to try to be a teacher. I'm supposed to take this exam. This is the study guide. I know none of this. This sound stuff, that has nothing to do, she said, with what it is that we're teaching with reading. She said, I'm trying to teach letters and comprehension and guided reading types of activities. And I went, oh dear. No wonder you're so frustrated. She had no idea what phonological and phonemic awareness was and phonics, and she's attempting to take this appropriate test that she had no information for. So no wonder she was flustered. So it was a beautiful opportunity for me to ask her, okay, when is your lunch break? And we had a crash course in the little lunch area about phonological and phonemic awareness. Sadly, I've had quite a few of those experiences. When I first learned that I didn't know what I needed to know to really impact change well, it was so long ago that the knowledge and practice standards through IDA did not exist. But I took Teaching Reading is Rocket Science, that little manuscript that Louisa had created at that point and written, and there was a little checklist at the back of all the information that a teacher should know and be able to do to impact change. And I just did my little check, check, check. Oh my gosh, I don't know anything about this. Check, check, check. And that actually helped me guide where I was going to go for my doctorate work. The information that I knew already, I felt pretty confident with, but I was missing this whole phonemic and phonological awareness piece. So under standard 1, the substandard 1.3, the foundational skills, one of the things that's important for us to know, as outlined in the exam, is that there's a reciprocal relationship and a reinforced support between phonemic awareness, the ability to layer those sounds to the letter and letter patterns, the decoding, recognizing words instantly, being able to produce them out your arm to spell them, and also the semantic and syntactic layers of language, your understanding of what words mean individually, and of course, how they play a role within sentences, the syntax piece. So this is an example of what we need to know and be able to do, because phonemic awareness affects the alphabetic principle. And if it's a weak link, then again, all the other pieces that we're trying to put into play in our instruction will be on a shaky ground. Sometimes I explain it like building a house, and you go to dig that foundation and you go to pour that foundation and it kind of cracks. But instead of going back and making that foundation solid, you just keep going and you put on the first floor. Maybe that first floor, kind of like our little Natalia, can stand still. But when you start putting the walls up and you put a little more in the first floor or attempt to put the second floor up, it starts to shake. It's pretty unsettling. And then at some point, it pretty much all falls down. So that phonological and phonemic awareness is very important as a foundational skill. So let's jump into that content, the what we need to know. And I'd like to talk about the place and manner of articulation. I do want to say up front, and for those of you who know me, I wish in another life that I was a speech and language pathologist. I'm not. But I've learned so much about linguistics and the importance of phonemic awareness by how we make those sounds that it made all the difference in my high school, my middle school, and now, of course, my elementary work with students in elementary and my authorship with Louisa in letters. So there are things when we think about this phonological processor where our phonology, the speech sounds are hardwired in our brain. We wire them by the feel and the look of the sound, not even just the sound of the sound. So behind the features, there are things like, well, there are consonant sounds and vowel sounds. So you might know that vowel is a word, a Latin word that comes from and is connected to a word like vocal. So when your airflow is unconstricted and kind of open, it carries the sound. That's a vowel sound. And a consonant sound, just by definition, is a sound that is constricted by something. Our brains wire in what's happening in your mouths when you make those sounds. For many of us, it's subconscious. But for kids who have weak links, or maybe they have difficulties in, synaptically being able to make those quick and accurate memory traces, we have to bring that to their conscious awareness. I can no longer say, can you hear the difference? I have to say, can you feel and see the difference in those sounds? I wrote an article in a blog recently about one of my students who said, Dr. Tolman, I'm so frustrated. I'm frustrated. I'm like, oh, the word you're trying to say is frustrated. That's what I said, he replied. I'm frustrated. He couldn't even hear or perceive the differences in what he was saying. And in Perspectives, I've written a number of articles about that same issue. Voiced versus unvoiced, of course, matters as well. So in our vocal cords, we have to perceive the differences between a sound that makes a vibration versus one that does not. And we're going to go through the phonemes briefly in just a minute. Stops versus continuance are important as well. The idea that our airflow matters in making a sound, and the awareness of what happens to our airflow sometimes is elusive to our children. So we have to bring it to their conscious awareness. There's a difference between versus shh. Go ahead and say that with me. Take your hand, put it in front of your mouth, pop out that sound that you think of for P. That's, of course, a stop sound, and it doesn't last very long. Now make that sound for SH. Shh. You can feel a lot of air there. So we are not always consciously aware of that. Some of our students, we have to bring that to their awareness. In addition to that, there are horrific sounds that go through our nose. Actually, have fun with those, the nasal sounds. I'll talk about those in just a moment. And those are tricky, and there are some tricky vowel phonemes as well. And again, remember, we don't have 26 sounds. We have, how many? That's right, I heard you say 44 phonemes. So if you had an opportunity to download or locate some handouts that were attached with our presentation, please go ahead and take out your sound worksheet now. If you didn't have an opportunity to do that, no worry. I'm going to show it to you right here on this worksheet. In addition, what's helpful in working with phonemes or speech sounds is to be sure you have your phone out or a mirror out so that you can see yourself while you're making those sounds. We'll go through these really pretty quickly. This is just an organizational sheet to be able to keep track of the consonant phonemes and the vowel phonemes. Here's what's troubling. Say the sound for the letter P. Now that, if you take your hand and put it under your throat, on your throat, and feel that again, there's not much that happens in your throat here. When you voice it, B, you look exactly the same. If you couldn't hear what I was saying, B, you might think that I was saying the exact same sound. So there's a lot of what we call overlap in the features of how you make the sound for what we typically think of as represented by a P or a B. And in our language, those are two that are easily confused, especially if children are not aware, or any people of any age aren't aware of what's happening in your throat. So if you have your worksheet next to the, which by the way, those slash marks are called virgules. And those virgules represent sounds. I'm not talking about the letter P, I'm talking about the phoneme. So next to that, please write B. We'll continue quickly and say for T. Everybody please take a moment. I'm going to look at my phone. You do the same. T, T. Go ahead and voice that. What happens? D. Please write the letter D with virgules next to that. The last stop sound that's unvoiced is K, and this is further back in your mouth, so it's extremely difficult to perceive because it's further back. It's easier to perceive sounds that are made in the front of your mouth. Make the sound of what we think of for the letter K sometimes. Voice it, and what comes out? G. There you go, virgules with a G. Now those 6 sounds are all stop sounds. So please write the word stop if you're using our worksheet because they pop out. They are tricky. And we're going to talk about the idea that when we're doing phonemic awareness activities and we only do words like cat, say cat, cat, tap it with me. K, at. Both of those, the beginning sound K and the ending sound T, are stop sounds. Stop sounds are so fleeting. They don't last a long time. They don't have a lot of airflow. So if our children are confused and struggling with phonemic awareness, we would probably want to try a continuant sound instead of a stop sound. It's a little bit easier. Even a word like sat is a better choice for segmenting and working with those phonemes because s is a continuant, even though you have that at the end for your stop. So those are the stop sounds. Let's do the fricatives. And believe me, my high school and middle school students used to have a lot of nicknames for the fricatives, but I'll leave it at that. Voice that. V. You write the letter V with virgules. The next sound is stick your tongue out. And then the voice partner to that is V. So in letters and sometimes in other professional development, we write a TH in those virgules, but we underline that just to remind ourselves that there are two sounds, F and V. In addition, a fricative is S, very hissy sound. If we turn on our voice box, what sound do you get? That's right, Z. So if you can write the virgules with a Z in there, that would be helpful. The next one is sh. And if I were to voice that, I get a sound that we typically think of in the French language, because they have that a lot with Jaja and Jacques. We don't have that in the beginning of our words a lot. It's usually in the middle toward the end, but it's j. So in this, for our purposes, we write a ZH with the slash marks. So please go ahead and take notes or make sure you have that on your speech worksheet. Lastly, Fromkin and Rodman is who we reference when we talk about the speech sound system, and they consider to be somewhat of a very fricative, hissy sound. There's some distortion way in the back of your throat with the airflow, and so you see the letter H. The next sound you'll see next to there is ch. Say that sound with me, ch. Look in your phone or your mirror and notice that you have that round ch sound, ch. If you voice that, what comes out? J. So I think of the letter J with the virgules. So now that you've filled that top part in, notice that all three of those sounds that are next, make those with me. That's my favorite. I love to hate that sound. In our workshops, we have fun with those. Those three phonemes are considered nasal sounds. What's problematic about nasals is there's the allophonic variation of nasalization. Whenever you have a vowel that precedes that nasal sound, that vowel often goes through your nose and gets distorted in anticipation of having the air flow through your nose for the nasal sound. It's why cat, say that word, cat, even though there's stops in the front and the back, it's an easy that is nice and not distorted. But if you say can, say that word, can. Wait a minute, that A no longer sounds like does it? It's kind of like a in my nose. Can. Please take a moment and feel the difference. Pinch the top of your nose, say cat, cat. Nothing happened to my nose. Keep that pinched, say can, can. I feel a little vibration. I usually do this too to really make that come alive. Close your nose completely. Say the sound for the letter M. Give it a try. Ready? Oh, watch out. It doesn't work, does it? Okay, so that shows us that the airflow goes through our nose. And if students can experience it in that way, then they become aware of those nasal sounds. They often wreak havoc. So those three sounds are all nasal sounds. The next two sounds are both what we call glided sounds. So you can fill that in as well on your worksheet. That y and woo are very tricky. They're very vowel-like and they glide into sounds that are around them. Sometimes we aren't even aware they exist in a word. For instance, you're a very well-educated audience, I know, but try this word. It's usually very difficult. Say cute, cute. Tap it. K, yi, oo, t. Many people will think that's 3 phonemes, but it's in fact 4. It has that glide yi in there. And when I say it's a hidden glide, that's because we don't use the letter Y to represent it. C-U-T-E. But long U, Pat Lindemood would have told me that she considers that a diphthong, two mouth movements for one speech sound. I would consider that more two speech sounds, the yi, which is a consonant phoneme, with the oo, which is that vowel oo that we sometimes think of as, well, in the color blue. Say blue. And now tap those sounds with me. B, oo, ooh, right? It's not blue, it's blue, ooh, that long U sound. Whew, that's tricky. Now the last two, which are also very problematic, are the liquid sounds. We have ooh, where we put our tongue up here in the front, or this is tricky. Some people teach that consonant R as But if I have a word like rat, say rat, rat. If you were to tell me that the sounds in rat are t, and I blend them, I'm going to get an rat. I don't know what that is. But if I do an kind of like a dog growl, so I often put my hands out here to help me, then and t, that's a little more representative of that consonant sound. And if I have three linguists in a room, they probably would all disagree on how we articulate that exactly. It's very problematic. Those two sounds are called liquid, or referred to as liquid sounds. So those are the consonant phonemes. You have a picture here of vowel phonemes on your worksheet, but I'll show you just in an enlarged format here that we are typically sometimes used to teaching vowels as letters, right? A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y or W. But in our language, we have 18 vowel phonemes, and they look like this. I usually put my hand under my chin. E, I, A, I, ah. That was going down from high to low with my tongue toward the front of my mouth. Try that with me. Ready? E, I, A, I, ah. Children who are not phonemically secure confuse sounds on this vowel chart that are close to each other. And if we go back up the other side, o, ooh. Try that with me. O, ooh. And then we put U over to the side, two phonemes, but we often teach that as long U in some programs. Oi and ow are our diphthongs. It just means two mouth movements for one speech sound. R, or, those are our vowel R's. And then, of course, we have schwa. We sometimes say schwa happens. Or I'd like to be like schwa because it's never stressed. Schwa is the vowel sound, typically or I, that's found in an unaccented syllable. When we don't stress that, it's just easier to come out of our mouths. That's really not a good crash course, but just a sort of a reminder. For many of you, you are familiar with these phonemes. For some of us, if that's new, and no worry, because it was new to me completely at one point in my instruction, you would want to study a little bit more and become more familiar with the phonemes in our language, which would lead us to, well, what are we supposed to be doing with those sounds? It's not natural to be aware of those sounds in isolation because w, e, d, u, n, a, t, s, p, e, k, u, I, k, v, I, s. My goodness, if we spoke like that, we'd be here till Christmas trying to finish this little webinar. So we don't speak in individual phonemes, we co-articulate, right? We smush those sounds together. And there are activities to be able to utilize to help kids become aware of those. There's a phonological awareness progression. And the reason that I have this sloppy looking little picture right here over to the right is that my brain went wild when I first read Dr. Kilpatrick's text, Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties. And actually the first time I saw him in person speak was in New Hampshire, which was very exciting to me. His work has certainly reverberated throughout our country and the world. And I should say, I think it's safe for me to tell this story. In one of my Wyoming districts, I have a school psychologist who really wasn't so sure that any of the science of reading meant anything until, and I had been there, gosh, maybe 5 or 6 years consulting. And then until one time I came for my visit and he ran up to me and said, Carol, you know all that information you've been talking about? It's true. I was like, okay. He said, yeah, look. And he pulled out, well, this book. And apparently, David Kilpatrick had spoken in Wyoming, and he had attended that. And because David is a speech and was a school psychologist, then it certainly gave credence to a lot of what we talked about. But it was at that time that I reconstructed what I wanted to talk about with the hourglass figure. I don't want to go into this in too much detail, only to say that this is a graphic that kind of came to me when I was trying to explain the information between the phonological processor and the orthographic processor, how they hook together to get words into your visual word form area, and that there's a progression that we use for instruction and for assessment. So the top part of that hourglass goes from big, long, connected streams of speech to slightly smaller and smaller units of awareness. And so David, and you can see, of course, in my little notes and my scribbles over here and my questions, helped me see that there was a basic and an advanced level of phonological to phonemic awareness. And some of the ahas were that we stopped teaching this way too early. Now, I know I taught this in upper elementary, middle school, and high school, but it was only with students who really struggled. And it was interesting to see that I would often find upper elementary students who hit the wall. They really couldn't get beyond blends in words or two-syllable words, compound words, and they really struggled with working with words that were longer. And truly, underneath all that, what was happening is their phonological and phonemic awareness had not gotten to the advanced levels, and it hadn't become proficient. So it was a big aha for me. Once you're aware of and can differentiate a speech sound from other sounds, then you're ready to, well, you need to know the letter names and what they look like, and then layer the most common letter and letter patterns, those are called graphemes, to that phoneme. And phoneme grapheme correspondences is what we see in that bottleneck right in the middle. I want to talk about this because we've been talking about this at the national level. And of course, Louisa was very gracious to write us a short little white paper about this. Lots of people nationally were questioning, well, wait a minute. If I have a student, regardless of how old they are, and I give them an assessment and I see that they're struggling, like remember that our second grader in our video was struggling even with compound words and rhyme and syllables and trying to pull them apart. And remember, she was in second grade. And the question is, and sometimes the practice occurs where regardless of how old the student is, they go back to the very earliest, easiest, well, syllables, alliteration, onset, and rhyme. Imagine doing that with our second grader or students that are a bit older, or my Matt, or my Bree, or my other students that you saw and met. So we were thoughtful of, well, wait a minute, is the ability to clap syllables, be aware of alliterative language, or be able to identify onset rhyme, is that really helping somebody who's well beyond that at this point, or should be beyond that, even though they can't do it? And so here, if you've not seen this position paper, is sort of a little short summary of what it is that Louisa was answering for this national question. Must all children master rhyming before we go to work with manipulating phonemes? And the answer is no. So she explained that very explicitly. When we think about the importance of phonemic awareness and what we're trying to do with our alphabetic principle, rhyming, syllable work, does not bring the language down to the individual phoneme level. And that's what we need in an alphabetic system, is to be aware of an individual phoneme to layer that on to a grapheme, a letter or a letter pattern. So if you've not seen this position paper, it's out in the world a lot, but certainly feel free. I can actually attach it if you would like, and it's out in the Facebook world as well, if you'd like to see the rest of that. It's a short and very succinct and helpful support for our practices. And I know when I was back working with middle school and high school students, I went right to the phonemic level, regardless of what they did with other areas. So this brings us to, when we talk about the what, we've talked about what the phonemes are, right? And how we have to manipulate them in different ways from early, basic, and advanced. We have to be aware of that. And the idea that we need to assess them in order to understand where students might be, especially when they're not where they're supposed to be. So I kind of mapped that on the hourglass a little bit by considering this. Once you are aware of a phoneme, which is down at the, well, I'll tell you in a minute where that might be, but that bottleneck here of where the orange, the phonemic awareness, that individual phoneme or speech sound, can now be layered on to a letter or a letter pattern, that grapheme, that's where you can begin with your letter naming fluency or your letter sound fluency. It's the first precursor and a good indication as to whether or not students will have trouble with phonics as they move forward. And it may tell us that phonology is an issue. Of course, in many of our screeners, we have what we call first sound fluency. And first sound fluency hits up at the onset and rhyme level. Now, in kindergarten, it is appropriate to be working with syllables, working with onset rhyme activities, of course. But some onset rhyme activities are more helpful than others. So let's take a moment, and Brenda's going to help us out again with a little poll. The question I'd like to pose to us at this point in thinking about onset rhyme examples. And by the way, in case we don't all know, an onset is the beginning consonant, sound, or sounds within, and I'm going to consider just a single syllable word, and the rhyme is the vowel and everything else that comes after it. So our onset and our rhyme. This is all hearing too, by the way, speech, right? So if I look at these 4 words right here, splash, chip, stop, and oak, which one of those, A, B, C, or D, is most effective to support eventual phonemic awareness? So I'm going to see, Brenda, if you can bring that poll up for people to vote in. Okay, I see it on mine. Okay, so again, our question is, which onset rhyme activity is most effective to support eventual phonemic awareness? Please go ahead, make your vote, and submit your answer. Okay. You know what I've learned, I think, is I try to work smarter, not harder, because we all, and you in particular, especially now, are working very, very hard to get results for our students. So in a limited amount of time, and now with a limited amount of access, we have to pick the activities and approaches that are going to make the biggest bang for our buck for our students. So some of these activities are much more effective in getting to phonemic awareness than others are. So I'm going to leave that there. I'll let some people, I'll let you all please vote on what you think the answer should be, A, B, C, or D. I'll continue on, and then I'll ask Brenda in just a minute what the results look like. But let's continue on for just a moment. To say, after first sound fluency, we often see PSF, and it's the first attempt to tap, tap, tap individual sounds. Usually, if we're thinking of Acadians or Ames Web or Dibbles, we often just see that at the CVC level. And we're going to see that that's not good enough. We're going to meet a student where that really left him failing. And then nonsense word fluency is our first opportunity to take a look at that bottleneck with more than one letter attached to a sound, not a letter sound fluency, but when we look at patterns that are not necessarily real words, can we look at those and decode them very quickly? And then, of course, we have oral reading fluency, which is the whole big picture. But you realize, and I try to show with this hourglass figure, that with your oral reading fluency measures, if there's a weakness there, we peel back the layers. Maybe it's because the phonics is weak. And if the phonics in our bottleneck with nonsense word is a little bit weak, maybe there's a weakness up on the top in the phonological and phonemic awareness. I know that we said that Natalia was a second grader, and that spelling sample, well, it's not a first grader, and it's not a third grader. I'll show you exactly who that student is and what that's like in just a bit, but it's an older student. And when we think of that and we have to peel back, this doesn't matter how old you are. If you have a weakness, it persists all the way through. So one of the nice things that we have now, of course, in our field is the past. David Kilpatrick has, of course, brought that to the forefront, and we can utilize that assessment. I'll show it to you in just a moment to be able to see where some of our students fall down in that continuum. It tells us whether or not they're on track for what we expect. And of course, it's not good enough just to assess phonology. On the bottom part, when we're talking about the letter and letter patterns along with phonology, phonic screeners and spelling inventories are extremely informative. Before we advance, Brenda, could I check and see how our responses are doing with the onset rhyme examples? Ah, great. Okay. So what I noticed is that, let's see, we see that chip, 42% of you voted for chip as being one of the most effective onset rhyme examples for phonemic awareness. And that's the accurate answer. That's right. Because when you say chip, what's the onset of chip? Ch. Could you show the results again, Brenda? Is that possible? Because, thank you, in the word splash, about a quarter of us chose splash. And in splash, what is the onset? Spl. Is that an individual phoneme? No, that's a blend, right? So the ability to be able to recognize that blend, it doesn't get us to the individual phonemic awareness activity. If you ask for the onset for chip, it does. It gives you the first sound and an individual sound, which is much more beneficial to the alphabetic principle. We also had the word stop. Say stop, stop. And in the word stop, the onset is st. That again is a blend. And actually that's a difficult blend because of what we call de-aspiration. That second sound in stop loses its push of air because it's the second sound in a blend. Kids often spell stop S-O-P, right? Or they might spell it S-D-O-P because they're having trouble with that, perceiving that second sound. That's when we have to start talking about what do you feel, what do you see, what does that word sound like, look like, see like. Some of you, about 10%, and thank you for this, chose oak. Say oak, oak. What's the onset? And remember, the onset is the beginning consonant phoneme or phonemes in the word. Well, wait a minute. That doesn't even start with a consonant sound, right? So you might have thought it was O, but the rhyme is oak. The whole word is the rhyme. There's no onset in the word oak. So it was a little tricky for me to have put that in there. No worry. Okay, and I always do say, I mean this honestly and sincerely, I had no idea about a lot of this for many, many years and just was kind of swimming around with this knowledge. And when people make mistakes like that, I really appreciate it because it helps me know how to be a better teacher and presenter for all of us. So thank you for taking that little survey and thinking about the word chip and its importance over and above splash and stop and oak. Here, in case you're not familiar with this, is the PAST test and the address that you can put right in there, thepasttest.com, to find multiple examples of the exam. We're going to take a look at the results of a PAST in just a moment. Okay. I had to put Hollis Scarborough's rote model in here when we start talking about what goes into phonological and phonemic awareness because that skill does not occur in isolation. And one of the things that I have to be careful of is that I used to take out one of these strands of the rope and teach it, but I forgot to weave it in completely. So what Hollis Scarborough's beautiful message to us in our field has shared is the idea that all of these strands are important. They all have research behind them as to their importance for reading and for spelling and for understanding what we read. You'll notice, and some of us call this or refer to this as the simple view of reading, that the bottom portion is all about word recognition, and our topic tonight is just that one strand of phonological awareness. But we have to help students with the alphabetic principle, top of the hourglass and bottom of the hourglass, and we also have to help them get words instantly with proficiency, as if by sight, in that visual word form area. But the major component, of course, on the reason to read is to understand what we read. So you'll notice the top part of the rope with language comprehension. Our background knowledge really matters, and so does vocabulary. And when I act out this rope model, those two strands in the rope are my thickest strands because there's a high correlation between your background knowledge and the vocabulary that you understand for the content that you are working with. Language structures like syntax and sentence structure, verbal reasoning, to be able to predict, to infer, to understand and follow the author's thread when there's pronouns and what they refer to, within the passage. That's an extremely important component. And I just want to put a little bug in our ear that language structures and verbal reasoning are often two strands of the rope that are missing in instruction directly, even in some of the programs that are out there now that support good background knowledge and vocabulary. Just be thoughtful of that. And then literacy knowledge, of course, with genres and what that is, and print concepts, how books are organized, so on and so forth. So obviously, always a great shout out to Hollis Scarborough and her amazing contributions to our field. But let's go back, of course, to phonological and phonemic awareness specifically. Whew. We've talked about the why and we've talked about the what. I really can't wait to talk about the how and get into some student questions and some examples of students' work. But I also want to be sure that I stop for just a moment and have Heidi and others help me know, are there any questions or clarifications that I should address at this point?
Hi, this is Heidi. Can you hear me, Carol?
I can hear you great, Heidi. Hi.
Excellent. So I have some great questions here, and we have lots of fans, Carol, saying how much they love you, and they're saying good morning.
I love them.
So we have lots of those. And I have a question here about rapid naming. What qualifies as rapid naming? Time, letters, words? What qualifies, checking on rapid naming?
You bet. Okay. All right. So Marianne Wolf would be the person that I would reference. And I actually have a summary document on my hard drive that I could perhaps link to, because that's an open domain. Before children know the names of the letters or the names that go to the numbers, neither of those can be predictive of whether or not you have a rapid naming issue, because the issue is that they don't know the names, right? So for younger children, you are left with colors and numbers. It is the rapid naming of letters that is typically, once you know the name of the letters accurately, the most highly correlated to your ability to have difficulties with retrieving that language and that connection quickly between all the layers of language within your brain, putting that back in your visual word form area. So again, when you know the names of the letters and you know them accurately, it is letter naming fluency. And before then, you can't use that, nor number naming usually, because kids struggle with being accurate.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple more big picture questions. So where can we find the knowledge and practice standards?
Beautiful. So you can go to the IDA website, International Dyslexia Association's website, and they are linked in there. Or if you go back, and my slides will be available, if you go back to the slides, the CERI, the Center for Excellence in EERI is reading instruction nonetheless. But the CEERI, that site that I had on my slide, will be another place where you can access those knowledge and practice standards. And as I was mentioning, when I looked at teaching reading as rocket science, I literally copied that out, gave myself a check plus if I thought I knew that pretty well, and I was only showing myself, so I was really honest. A check if I thought I knew a little bit about it but needed more, and a big fat 0 if I had no idea what they were talking about. Do you know, at one point I thought morphemes were morphine, like people were talking about drugging kids. I was so confused by that layer of language. So when you know what you are strong in, that helps you find what you might be weak in. And so copy out the knowledge and practice standards, give yourself a little check plus or a 0, and then be on the lookout for what you should be learning. It can be a really nice individualized self-study for you. Okay.
Great. Let's do one more big picture question, Carol.
Sure, Heidi.
What's the difference between phonological and phonemic awareness?
Love it. Okay, thank you. So phonological awareness, and I'll answer that actually by going back to the hourglass just for a heartbeat. Phonological awareness is the big overarching term right on the top here that you see that we utilize for all the different layers of sounds that and parts of sounds that we are manipulating and becoming aware of. So phonological awareness would include something like syllables, but syllables aren't individual sounds, right? They They aren't necessarily. They could be, but they aren't necessarily. So, and neither are onset and rhyme necessarily. So phonological awareness is that big umbrella term that refers to everything that we manipulate on that top part of the list of the hourglass. Phonemic awareness as a phoneme, an individual sound, when you begin to manipulate the individual phonemes. So phonemic awareness begins right here at the basic level when we start blending and segmenting those sounds. Sometimes you start getting closer to phonemic awareness with onset. If, for instance, our answer was B, well, we'll use a word like chip and we ask what the onset is, and it's ch. Now we're becoming aware of an individual phoneme. That's getting closer to phonemic awareness. So the difference is phonological awareness is the big umbrella term for all of those activities. Phonemic awareness is only when you manipulate or become aware of an individual sound.
Thank you, Carol. Well, please ask more questions for the next section.
Okay, thanks so much, Heidi. This is great. Okay, the how now and how not, I should say how not. I perhaps do learn a lot more about what to do by making mistakes. So I always say to you, I made so many mistakes. Let me share with you what they are so then you won't make them, right? So the how and how not of assessing and teaching phonological awareness here. So when we think about this, and this picture really represents the types of materials that we're working with, it's been interesting because I know I used to use this too. And when I walk into a classroom, you can almost tell, and I want you to sense this about your classrooms, perhaps, or tutoring areas, whatever's appropriate. Visually, you can tell whether or not there's the appropriate representation of speech to print. So what's happening here? We know that we have these words that have boxes around them. You might notice that's trying to talk about the visual impact of that word and not the speech to print system of our language. So if we think about trying to teach words by visually how they look, that's not how we put words in our visual word form area. They have to feed through this phonemic awareness and the phonological processor that I was explaining. So the other issue is, what's the sound for the letter T? It's T, right? T-H-I-S. How do you pronounce that word? Oh yeah, this. Tap those sounds. V, I, S. What's that first phoneme? V. Wait a minute. It's under the T for T. Do you see how that can be very confusing for children? So you'll also notice that the shape really can't help us. This is an example of a slide that has the shape of the word shape. But watch, this shape could also be the word ch, I, p, s. See, the same visual outline, but a whole different word. So we don't recognize words by how they look. We map them, phoneme, grapheme mapping. So the word shape, tap those sounds, sh, a, p, and we talk about fast and automatic recognition of words by that orthographic mapping, our ability to be able to go from sound to symbol, be aware of those individual sounds and layer them with the letter and letter patterns. This is a New Hampshire school, and I love this story, but this is a first grade classroom quite a bit ago, and we had worked with the phonemes and talked about the importance of changing things not from a word wall, but into a sound wall. Now, thankfully, for people like Dr. Mary Dahlgren and others in our field who have really supported sound walls, we have lots of materials and lots of examples out there in the world that have appropriate sound walls for our classrooms. So the phonemic awareness you can see here with the mouth picture, and there's a p, pilot, and b, not really sure what that is, bat. A little hard to see, but you'll notice that that's the mouth picture that you want kids to look at and be aware of, and consciously be able to perceive and produce and differentiate from other sounds that sound like it. That's when you become really phonemically aware. So sound walls, again, that's a whole topic for another day, but that really reinforces good phonemic awareness. The other piece to think about is that this instructional progression is not all inclusive. I want us to think about the idea that there's easier to more complex abilities to blend and segment. And we sometimes confuse that, or we often stop teaching at the CVC, 3-sound level, right? Which is a problem. So if you think about it that way, with our basic level of blending and segmenting, I might want my student to be aware of just one phoneme. If it's a consonant phoneme, I might even say something like, show me at the very basic level. And they would put their lips together, look at my mouth, match it to theirs, maybe look in a mirror, say, and then move one chip, right? Because they wouldn't be spelling at that point if it's phonemic awareness. Then I might have a vowel sound. And in that vowel sound, one vowel sound, I might say, show me ah. And they would say ah, move a chip, touch it. That's the very beginnings of being aware of an individual phoneme. Then we go to 2 sounds. We might have a vowel consonant. Show me the sounds in it. It, well, they might move 2 chips for it. Or show me the 2 sounds in me. E. E, and move 2 chips. And when you start getting to more than one sound, you would ask them, for instance, out of order, after they put the 2 chips down, you might point to the first chip and say, what sound? And then point to E. And when you get to more sounds, like our 3 sounds, you might ask them, so do this with me, say ship, ship, tap it, sh, p, then map it with chips, sh, p. And then you would point to the hardest sound in there would be the internal vowel. You would point to the middle chip and say, what sound is that? And hope that they can perceive that. And if not, whatever they give you, you help them fix what it feels and looks like to get to the right sound. Now, this is really true as you add more sounds. We're going to see a student that's having trouble at this level in just a moment. Now we have a blend in the very beginning. An example would be broth. This type of word made me laugh. One of the beauties of being home a little bit more recently is that I'm tutoring virtually. So in working with one of my students, what was really fun is we had a big aha a bit ago, that there was the idea that, wait a minute, there are only, in some words, b, ah, 4 sounds, but wait a minute, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters. It was really very funny. And then, of course, trigraphs really tripped her out. She really was surprised by that. But we're talking about the speech to print nature. So we want to tap, tap, tap these sounds and then be aware of them. In the word broth, do you know what sound is going to be the most difficult? If we've studied together before, my guess is you'd say that second sound, that r sound. And students might spell that BOTH if they were spelling and showing you. But if you move the chip, b, ah, f, you would point to the second chip and say, what sound? And ask them to tell you what it is. If they say ah, you know they're having trouble with those internal sounds. You would get them to look at your mouth and repeat the sound r and ask them to repeat it back to you. And the same goes on as we get more difficult. In the word lint, do you know what sound will be most difficult? You're right. It's the sound. And what type of sound is that again? It's that nasal sound, which is really difficult. In the word shrugs, sh, r, g, z. Now we have 5 phonemes. And the r and the g will be 2 sounds that'll be the most difficult for students. They'll often leave them out or distort those sounds, have trouble with putting chips there. And until you can get those chips right, you don't have the parking spots in phonology to then layer the letter and letter patterns to. Strong would be a triple blend in the very beginning. STR is usually the blend we think of for s, t, r. And then our last phoneme is that nasal sound, so that one's tricky as well. Students will often leave out that r. So when we're doing chips, we want to be sure they get all of the letters, and you would point to the third chip and say, what sound? The second chip, what sound? The last one, what sound? You would say, point to ah, and they would point to the 1, 2, 3, 4th sound, and the 4th chip right there. So knowing that out of order really quick, proficiently, and then putting it all together is important in our instruction. Lastly, this is just still in single syllable words. We have a word like scraps. So of course the k and the r and the p are all going to be very difficult, as well as that ah. So go in and out once they've put those chips down, and talk about those. So there's a little cautionary tale about working with some materials to help support this phonemic awareness. So I went out on Open Domain to look at some pieces that are out there. And this is a little demo that I just pulled from YouTube that looks at first glance really appropriate and very helpful here. So take a look at these words over here to the side: sled, wed, led, fed, bed, read, ed. And Brenda's going to help us. We have a poll here. I'd like to know what you think about this activity here, this open source activity. So if we could bring that poll up and take a look at our questions. What I'd wonder is what we would use that, thank you, Brenda, what we would use that sound chain for. So imagine this, that you as the teacher have these words, you're not showing the students. So this is not something they're spelling, but you would say sled and they would move chips. Now move that, change that to wed or to led. What would be an effective use for this sound chain? Would it be reinforcing eh? Would it be producing rhyming words? Would it be both of those? Or would it be none of the above, of the above? So please take a moment and vote A, B, C, or D for second, third, or fourth. Tell me what you think. Submit your answers. And again, this was just on open source on YouTube. Words like sled, wed, led, fed, bed, read, and ed. What would those help with? Okay. While we're taking a look and while we're calculating those responses, you might notice too that we have this vowel chart here. In my brain, phonemically, I always have the consonant phoneme chart and a vowel phoneme chart in my head. And the reason I do that, and I have it in my working memory, is when children make mistakes in how they articulate words, like, Dr. Tolman, I'm so frustrated. I immediately know what to say to help with that, because I can picture the consonant phonemes and I can picture exactly what's being left out. Those are the liquid sounds. Or when a child misspells something, like for instance, we have a pen and they write P-I-N instead of P-E-N. I either know that they're like my good friend Michelle from Texas, whom I love dearly, or it may, because of her dialect, or it may be that they're having trouble with the difference between eh, and I have to then say, okay, let me help you out. Is when you just put your fingernail. So if you want to try this while we're waiting for the poll, take your fingernail, put it in between your teeth and smile. Now take the whole fingertip and put it in between. Can you feel how that opened your mouth a little bit? It's not easy to feel it with your chin, but that gives you a little guidance. Kids make that mistake all the time. So it's a little bit helpful if they misspell words and have trouble with that confusion. We can help them with the feel and the look. And of course, they should always be looking at themselves when they do that. How are we doing with the poll, Brenda? Ah, beautiful. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So an effective use for the sound chain, was it A, 10% of the people chose it reinforces the short E sound. 22% chose that it works with rhyming words. 46%, almost half, said both A and B. It was great to work with and it also helped with producing rhyming words. And then the last one, 22%, is none of the above. I'm going to put my vote with the 22% of you that said none of the above. Here's why. A couple things. One is this. With a sound chain, the purpose of a sound chain is to help us differentiate between phonemes with what we call minimal pairs. And that's two words that minimally have a difference in only one phoneme. Right away in the very beginning, they broke that rule. Say sled, sled. Tap those sounds. S-L-E-D. What's the next word? Wed. See what they did? They took out s and ul and put in w-ed. So now I'm taking out a whole blend. That's not even phonemic awareness. It's not helping me with that. It's taking off the whole onset, right? Which is not going to get us our awareness of an individual phoneme. If I think about, well, it's not really producing rhyming words because I'm just giving the students those sled and wed and led and fed and bed. If I want to know that my students are aware of the sound, which we just talked about as being one of the difficult vowel phonemes, I'm going to go back to my chart here, and I'm going to think about, okay, this is what usually happens. I have this sound chart here, this, my sound chart, but when I work with my vowel phonemes and I have this in my mouth, I want to know, and in my head, if I want to know it usually gets confused with as I just was mentioning. A better choice would be this. Say sled, sled. Tap sounds, s, d. Show me the chips. S, d. So they're putting out a chip or a block or something to represent those phonemes. And then I'm going to point to the third chip and I'm going to say, what sound? And hopefully they'll say, And I'll say, if that word is sled, now show me slid. So they have to be aware of and then discriminate between and I. Those are two phonemes that are very close in articulation. And if they can't do that, I have some work to do. Can you see the difference between sled, slid, and using words as minimal pairs, as opposed to this open sort activity that manipulated two sounds in the beginning, went down to two sounds, CVC, and then two sounds at the end? It never manipulated out of it at all. So you didn't have to do anything. You actually had a better shot at teaching and being aware of the individual phoneme w, l, f, b, r, than anything. And that wasn't your goal in the lesson. Same thing could be used for bed and bid, set and sit. But what if you have real trouble with that as a student? Then you go to a little wider contrast. That's where an expert teacher in the same amount of time has an activity that could be like this. Let's take and compare it with ah. It's two, right now they're having a hard time with and you've tried your fingers and the fingernail idea. So now you might have something like this. Med, say med, ed. Change that to mud. Say mud, mud, d. Can you feel a difference? So do you see how that change is a wider contrast, and it's a little easier for students at first to be successful in identifying the change, and then of course you get to eventually go from to I. So it's just thoughtful. That's a kind of a cautionary tale about what we need to know about the sound charts and how they relate to each other in order to really provide some very solid phonemic awareness activities. Now, there's the whole reason to do phonemic awareness activities is not because they're fun, and you can make them a lot of fun. They're great fun. It's a means to get to phonics and the alphabetic principle to read and to spell. So I would be remiss not to say that once we're aware of our sounds, then we take these common letter-in-letter patterns like a, I, are short vowel phonemes because they're very consistent in closed syllables, and some of our more stable consonant phonemes, and then we start mapping those together. So if I take z, a, for instance, then I can go from my phonemic awareness now to my phonics very easily by doing something like this. Help me. Say zap, zap. Tap it, z, a, p. So I'm moving a chip for each sound. What's the first sound in zap? Z. What letter do you think of? Z. So please take a moment. I'm going to lift up that chip and I'm going to ask my student to write or move a tile with the letter Z. The word we're working with is zap. Please be careful not to put your finger in the socket. You will zap yourself. The middle vowel sound is a. What letter do you think of? Here you go. It's an A. Go ahead and write that in that middle box. What's the last sound in zap? That's that stop sound. That's a little trickier. What letter do you think of? Oh, that's right. It's a P. Go ahead and write that there. What's the word we just spelled? It's zap. And then I would ask them to spell that word, Z-A-P, and say the whole word, zap. Now I have taken that awareness, that phonemic awareness in my phonological processor and layered it back in with my orthographic processor. Phoneme graphing mapping. This is the way that you start it in a very scaffolded, supported way When students make mistakes, you think about it, especially the conversations we just had with and devise activities that would be very purposeful to the mistakes that they are making. So we would do things like that with mop or tag, so on and so forth. I'm not going to belabor this because I know you're an advanced audience, but it would do the same thing. Say the word, tap, 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 put out chips, spell it, and here we go. But I'd like to come back to the student here. Brenda, can you help us remember what grade level we thought the student was? We had 8% of us thinking it was first grade. And I'm with you. I wouldn't have guessed first grade because it's a little more advanced than what you would expect a first grader to know and be able to do. Third grade, we had a third of us saying it was a third grader. It could be reasonable. 44% of us decided that it might have been a fifth grader. And 12% of us thought it was a seventh grader. I'll tell you that, well, you met some of my students. Many of them couldn't even write as well as and spell as well as this child did. This student is a fifth grader. So when we take a look at the student and we understand what this student can and cannot do, one of the things that was really interesting is securing them in a number of phonemic awareness activities and awareness. And I noticed that there were some things that were really missing. I had to secure the vowel sounds, the short vowel sounds, because look what happened with mud. Isn't that interesting? And in number 4, do you remember what that word was? It's supposed to be fog. Well, you probably see this, right? Fog, right? When we don't clip our sounds, our stop sounds, remember we said our stop sounds are hard. They're difficult because they don't persist for a long time. They only have that push of air that pops out. So fog, if that's how you teach it, that might be what you get for spelling with your students. You actually did a nice job with some of these blends here. I was concerned about like a scrape. And then 13 was one of the things that I was thoughtful of, because remember that word is champ. And I noticed also in his reading that he left out some nasals or put in nasals oftentimes. And he also had a hard time representing all these sounds accurately. So when we think of this type of information and we gather a past, for instance, we might gather this past along with that spelling inventory, along with a phonics screener. But take a look here. This is the example of what a student like that would give you for a word like sleep. If you said, say sleep, sleep. Now say sleep and don't say s. What came out was the rhyme, eep. They weren't able to identify that individual phoneme. S. Same thing for crane. Can you see that pattern? Say crane, crane. Now say crane, but don't say k, and we got ain. The whole onset came off, right? So they're unaware of the two sounds within the blend. And you'll notice that once you give corrective feedback, 2 of those examples with bright and flows worked. They got them accurate and automatic, but they still made the student happen to make still lots of mistakes, really working with words that had the blends. So when we think about that, we might want to consider something like this, an activity like this.
Say stick.
Stick.
Tap sounds. How many sounds did you hear? So let's move our markers for each sound in stick. S, t, k. Stick. What sound? What sound? Point to Where's s? And now zap it. Stick.
All right, so we're trying to get our students phonemically aware with the specific pattern that we want them to have proficiency with, which is the blends. So then, of course, after we have a blend in the beginning and a blend in the end, our next step would be to build a little bit longer words where we have blends in the beginning and blends maybe at the end. So we're going to build this with a word like in slap and plot or mops. We have blends in the beginning or the end. But I want to share with you this exact student that was struggling with the past, that was struggling with some of those blends within the spelling inventory that I shared with you, did this after our tap, 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 tap work here. And this was very automatic and accurate. And this was after 2 sessions. Blot, blob, blush, flush, flash, slash. See what I was trying to do is manipulate some of the blends in the beginning, blends in the end, put a nasal blend in the back because he was having a hard time with perceiving and producing that when he read, and he also definitely when he was spelling. Blot would have been B-O-T a couple times right in here. So he didn't get tripped up even with that. Some of you know that DR, that sounds like jur, like a J, that affrication of the D when it's followed by that liquid R. So very quickly, when you make students aware of a particular phoneme and its position within that word, it's much more appropriate to be able to help. Now, when you don't know how all of this fits together, which I did not know for many, many years. I had no idea that phonemes even mattered and were important. This is an example of what that child had to do for a spelling exam. You might recognize some of these words, like shampoo or castle, catalog, cabinet, lantern. Look at number 4, blanket. Drop the nasal right in here, right? Now, and this was after studying, meaning that he looked at those words and tried to study them and really get them solid for a week. And this is, what he was able to do, 9 wrong and 6 correct. So it's much more appropriate, of course, to go back to the phonemic awareness where a student is weak and to build that up with the type of activities we've talked about, first at the phonemic level, and then we layer on the letter and the letter patterns in here. So just a little shout out that effective spelling tests are not necessarily words that come out of your content and words that are vocabulary words. They're really the pattern words that are being taught specifically. And practice makes perfect, of course, with decodables. You might, like for the student here, when I were to give him a spelling test, my choice would be to say, I'm going to give you these 5 words, and I'm going to give you 5 other words, but I'm not going to tell you what they are, but they will follow the patterns that we've been working with, everything that we're teaching now and everything behind. And if I have the proper phonemic awareness underneath all that, he can do that just fine. Okay, because remember, that's not a visual task. And I do want to share with you as we finish up our time together, just a little bit of harmony. And harmony comes from a school in Maryland, and I'm giving harmony the pass, but I want to share with you what is possible with good instruction.
Great. Harmony, thank you for taking a minute to do this test with me. This is all about sounds.
I'm going to pop us right here.
Now say beak.
Beak.
Now say beak, and instead of E, say A.
Back.
Beak with an A is bake. Okay, just try this one. Say fine.
Fine.
Now say fine, and instead of I, say O.
Oh.
Okay. Let's try these. Say bread.
Bread.
Now say bread, but don't say R.
Bed.
Thank you.
Good girl.
Say sneak.
Sneak.
Now say sneak, and don't say
Seat.
Okay. Say crew.
Crew.
Now say crew, and instead of R, say ul.
Blue.
Say proud.
Proud.
Now say proud, and instead of R, say ul.
Loud.
Say
She's a first grader. And actually in the beginning of first grade, right? So what I am very proud of, I want to stop on that word proud, and she should be proud, she is proud of herself, is that with very good phonemic awareness instruction, she has really taken on and understood the alphabetic principle very well. So she went all the way through, not just the first page in the past, but a lot of the second page in the past. She scored much like a mid-year second grader. On the past, and this is in the beginning of first grade. It's all so very possible. And I'd like to share as we finish up here that, of course, phonemic awareness can be taught and taught well. One of my schools, and maybe some of you from the school might be on our webinar. I'm so proud of you, and I know that you're proud of yourselves. We've been working together for many years. This is a first grade report from our coach of a Wyoming elementary school with the past. the phonological awareness screening test, Dr. Kilpatrick's test that we referenced a little bit earlier. You might notice on the D1, E3, I mean, if you're not familiar with this, all that to say that it mentions which grade level should have attained each of these areas of phonemic awareness, phonological and phonemic awareness. Do you notice that at the end of kindergarten, E3, deletion of syllables, and F, kindergarten to mid-first grade, and G, kindergarten to middle of first grade, is where students kind of should be. And you'll notice to in H, early to late first grade, and all the way to I, and toward the end, early to late first grade is where students should be. This is in September 25th. And they actually start school a little bit later, so they haven't had a lot of instruction. In a sense, this is their end of kindergarten data, if you think about it. So I'm very proud, and I know they are, and this is one little snapshot of about 6 pages of 4 different classrooms that are first grade classrooms, all coming from kindergarten, moving up into their first grades, that have had very solid instruction in phonemic awareness. If we follow their data through with the phonics and their phonics skills, you will find that there are very few students that still struggle with basic phonics or even advanced word study. And every year they just keep getting stronger and stronger with their data at earlier and earlier grades. You might question, well, Carol, what about this H student that only had 2 out of 5 here in H2 and 1 out of 5? That's a student that moved in and actually did not have kindergarten in that school, because we were talking about that case. And that's the specific situation there, which is kind of interesting. So it's very exciting to see that at a whole class level, in small group levels, and of course with individuals that are dyslexic, especially due to an issue in the phonological processor, that things can be done. And we certainly, with good knowledge, can be armed with the information to teach those students at very deep levels and to be like Dr. Bree, as I was showing you earlier. One thing I'd like us to reflect as we finish our time together tonight, or whenever you're watching this as a recording, would be, how did today validate what it is that you already have for good practice? And what might you do differently based on the discussions that we've had? Is there anything that you might adjust or change or reconsider, or maybe any action plans that you have? It might be looking up those knowledge and practice standards and thinking about your knowledge base and how that can be improved. And mine always can be improved. And I'm always thinking about what else I can read. And what do you currently do that is really based on solid research that gets you the practice and the results that you really, really need for our students? So I would challenge you to think through those questions, if you could, because of course, the whole reason to understand the science of reading isn't to understand the science of reading, it's to make a difference in our students' lives. And this is a life and a game-changing situation. It is crippling for some people that don't get the right instruction and they can't read and spell at high levels. And it is life-changing, as you can tell, when they do get the right instruction. I do want to end by saying, can you read this? Watch the mouths. A, y, oo, or thank you for spending your time with me and with us. I thank very, very from the bottom of my heart, New Hampshire IDA, and appreciate the ability and the honor to be able to present tonight with you and for you. Again, I feel like I don't do nearly enough in my own home state because I don't stay still long enough. So it's been a real pleasure to work with you all on the New Hampshire board. And thank you to all of my friends and acquaintances that are out there. And for people who I may not know, I hope to meet you again in the future. I'll stop right here and I'll just ask Heidi if there are any questions or comments that we might need to address before we finish our time together.
We have one from John Willis. I'm thinking he is saying, how do we talk to teachers about clipping those sounds? So if we're hearing things like ka and da, I mean, how do we quickly do that? And if we're a teacher, how do we just simply clip those sounds?
Thank you. And I love you, John. Okay, here's what I would do. I would say, I would say this, and actually our spelling sample that we saw is a good way to actually start talking about that. So I want to see if I can go back to the spelling of the student who put the at the end, my 5th grader here. Okay, yep. Number 4, fog, right? So I might notice that if I see something like that, or if I hear it in the classroom, and I'd say, I would always find something right about what the student did or what the teacher was doing. So I might say, nice job. I really like how you represented that sound ah with your students. Let's take a look at the sound g. And I would always leave my but out of it. I wouldn't say like, but you messed up the g, right? And I would say, and let's take a look at the g. And when we think about g, that sound is so hard to make because it's a stop sound. So physically, here's a way that you could help clip that. Take your hand, put it under your chin, and I want you to say the sound for G, and don't let that chin move. Ready? G, g. Try it with me. G. Or p, t. You see, your chin barely moves. And if you were to say ta or ga or pa or ga, your chin moves widely. So I would do a physical representation and show them the difference, and then I would help model that quite a bit and get the students to articulate it back to me accurately as well.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a few more minutes for a couple more questions. If you are a parent with a middle schooler with poor phonemic awareness, what do you recommend that they do given exposure to their special education teachers?
Given exposure to their...
So yeah, if you're a parent with a middle school poor phonemic awareness, I'm just going to say it means, what do you recommend to talk to your special education teacher about?
Sure. Well, I always think that it's important to be as informed as you can be about how we learn to read and spell, and that phonemic awareness level is extremely important. I will say that it is never, ever too late to be able to remediate phonological and phonemic awareness, and I'm living proof of that with the work in the middle school, the high school, and I also want to say the oldest person that I remediated with phonemic awareness was 55 years old. I love her. So with that in mind, we know that it's possible. The relationship that you can develop with that teacher is most important. And of course, instead of coming at it as you're not including this, I certainly would want to try to figure out what the teacher knew and understood about that. But it is never too late. And if the phonemic awareness is weak, there are things like the past. You can go to that little website that I showed you. And pull off a past and learn how to give that and give that to your child and see how they do. And you can take that kind of information along with spelling, spell these words, see if sounds are left out, and start having conversations about that. But the more you can be informed and the better able you are to make a relationship with each other, the better off you'll be for your child.
Awesome. So I'm going to do one more question, and then for everyone involved, we will be answering all of the questions and then sending them out to everybody. So people would like to know where to get the sound wall pictures.
Great.
That's a couple people asked for those.
Fabulous. So one place you could get them, very contemporary, are tools for reading. And the 4 is the number 4. So tools, TOOLS, for reading.com. The mouth pictures that you saw, because remember I'm really old, I've been around doing this a long time, were my lips pictures from the Linda Mood Bell program, actually. So what you saw on that wall in the New Hampshire classroom were the lips mouth pictures. They're called large mouth pictures that come along with that program. And I'll give you one other place that you could find pictures if you are very careful about how students articulate their mouths. The best representation that I've ever seen, and it was in that Wyoming school that I showed you all the green with their data. The best representation is Erin took pictures of her students and then making the mouth pictures and then put that up as the sound wall. So the students could produce and recognize each other's mouths and say when they're trying to tap sounds, hey, that's Gabe's sound, and then spell it appropriately. It was adorable.